Right, so as Teresa said, the original paper was called Aesthetic Judgment and Aesthetic Understanding. But I am going to slightly change that and present a slight development on the kind of the ideas I put. Oh, my screen sharing is paused. What does that mean? Can you still see the PowerPoint or not? Yes? Okay. A strange note. Okay, sorry. So this is going to be a slight development on the paper that I originally wrote. So I'm going to change the title slightly to Aesthetic Understanding and the Normative Structure of Aesthetic Appreciation. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, outline the notion of aesthetic understanding that I put forward in that original paper, which is I term a form of appreciative understanding. Then I'm going to move on to the main kind of question that I want to answer today. So that's the question about appreciation and normativity. And there are two kinds of questions there, which I'll outline when I come to them a little bit later.
Jeremy, just a
Yes.
technical thing. Have you already moved forward in your presentation?
Yes.
In that case, we are still with the first slide. So that's what pause means.
Thank you.
I think that, yes.
Yeah, it works now. Good.
It works now. Brilliant. Thank you, Teresa. I thought there was going to be some problem, but and there was. Good. Right. So now hopefully you can see this. I'll leave it in non full screen. Right. So the plan, as I said, number one, to look at outline aesthetic understanding, then to look at the normative structure of appreciation. That's number two. And then to consider a couple of views that you can have about the normative structure of appreciation. So broadly speaking, a cognitivist view and a hedonistic view. And then I'm going to point out problems with those views and going to bring back in my notion of aesthetic understanding to give us a kind of what I think is going to be a better view. So this is going to be very brief, just to introduce how I think of aesthetic understanding. So my ultimate claim is going to be that aesthetic understanding is the epistemic state which appreciation is normatively structured to promote. So that is, as opposed to it being structured as to promote a discrete affective state like aesthetic pleasure, or a pleasure in striving engagement, or a form of perception, or correct judgments, or the grasping of reasons why something is aesthetically valuable. So on my notion of aesthetic understanding, it primarily involves appreciation and the capacity to manifest and explore the aesthetic value of artworks. So that's why I term it a form of appreciative understanding. So it has two components, which I'm just going to very briefly go through. And I'm going to do that by looking at an example. So I'm taking this from T.J. Clarke's discussion of Guernica. So what T.J. Clarke does in that book, and what most of us do, what we should do when we're appreciating works, I think, is we first of all try and identify a theme or aim which the work has. So when Clarke does this, he identifies Guernica's theme as the new form of terror that bombings like the fascist bombings of the village of Guernica bring into being. And we think that the painting's mode of presenting this new terror involves a presentation of how the new form of death by blanket bombing impacts human life and community. So here's what he says. I think this is representative of what art critics are, the kind of thing that art critics are usually doing. So he says, humans especially structure their lives imaginatively in relation to death, but certain kinds of death break that human contract. Life should not end the way it does here. Some kinds of death have nothing to do with the human. They possess no form as they take place. They come from nowhere. Time never touches them. So the measure of Guernica's achievement is that it finds a way to propose this visually. So the notion of aesthetic understanding, which I'm not really arguing for here, I'm just kind of putting it on the table, is bound up with exploring things like the perspective that Guernica achieves. And my assumption, again, which I'm going to assume and not argue for here, is that Guernica's aesthetic value is bound up with the value of this perspective. So the way the painting brings before us this new perspective on this new form of terror is the painting's aesthetic value. Okay, so when we've identified that aim or theme that a work has, what do we do after that to try and improve our aesthetic understanding? Well, then we try to organize aspects of the work's character under this theme and make sense of them by relating them to this theme. So the goal in doing this is to elicit kind of a more nuanced understanding of the perspective that the work develops. So we address particular features of the work and ask what role they play in developing that work's perspective. So this is going to be very crude, obviously, because I'm going to do it in about a minute, but here's the kind of thing we might do. So we might think, why this setting in Cubism? Why place the figures in this space between the inside and the outside in some communal space and have the kind of the bombing affect them there? Well, we can start thinking, we can contrast the space in Guernica, the setting of the painting of Guernica, with other paintings that Picasso's doing in the years before this, which take place inside a room in a kind of cool, contemplative, private setting. And we can say, okay, we understand one reason for moving the figures outside is that the outside is a public space, it's a communal space. And it seems, to me at least, that there's almost some intimation that the figures are pushed out of some sort of portal or room at the back right of the painting. And that maybe connotes the fact that this cool, contemplative, private space is being destroyed by these, by this bombing, by this new form of warfare that's coming in. So we might also think that the communal space is the appropriate stage on which the individuals are torn apart by the bombing and dispersed into their own individual terror. And kind of when we get to grips with these things, when we try and explain them, when we link them to our what we see in the painting, we get to things like this, where we grasp something about the perspective of the work. So we might grasp that the terror is presented as having this character, so the character to tear apart communal life, to isolate and disperse the community. So that's very, very brief and horribly crude, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's the very activity of aesthetically understanding the work. So it's precisely in that process that we elicit the value of the work. That is, that we become able to occupy the perspective and to gauge the richness of the perspective that it offers. So again, clarificatory notes. So what is appreciative understanding? Well, it's not mere justificatory understanding. It's not about a grasp of reasons, understanding why something is valuable. Instead, it's the capacity to manifest the value of the work and to explore its aesthetic value by exploring the perspective it offers on its subject matter. So clearly, this aesthetic understanding is not a discrete perceptual episode. It's not a discrete affective episode. It's not reducible to aesthetic pleasure. But one thing I do want to claim, and claim in the other version of the paper, is that aesthetic understanding is the only route to accessing fine-grained aesthetic value. So the kind of value which the work has in virtue of manifesting this perspective towards its subject matter. So immediate perception and affective responses, so things like immediately seeing the figure's anguish or feeling anguish oneself or feeling aesthetic pleasure, are inadequate modes of experiencing the painting's aesthetic value. They and the painting itself must be made sense of if we're to grasp what is genuinely of aesthetic value. So, as I say, that the thing that is of aesthetic value being the kind of new perspective which the painting manages to propose visually. So when we get aesthetic understanding, we want to be able to form some interpretation which helps us draw out this perspective of the work. And this also necessarily involves a kind of experiential component. So in this case, the perspective is irreducibly visual. So our appreciation can't be purely theoretical. It has to involve us being able to experience the work as having the value that we ascribe to it in our appreciative interpretation. So that's very quick, but now I just wanted to put that on the table so I can then now go on and talk about the normative structure of appreciation and use this notion of aesthetic understanding in that debate. Okay, so first of all, in section 2, we're going to want to know, what do I mean by the normative structure of appreciation? Well, there are various norms in force in our appreciative practices. So some of them are what I call engagement norms, and these are what I'm going to focus on today. So we have things like a restriction on deference to testimony. So we think there's something wrong about completely deferring to the testimony of experts. So obviously it's controversial how we cash out all of these different norms I'm going to talk about, but it's genuinely agreed or generally agreed that there is some kind of restriction on how we should use testimony. There's also something, it seems, about our practices that seems to promote autonomy, that is working stuff out for oneself, and obviously that links to the deference, the restriction on deference. We also have this object focus, which seems to be a norm which is inherent in our appreciative practices. So this is, we can capture this, or we can think that various things we're very familiar with link to this norm to focus on the object rather than one's own idiosyncratic subjective response. So we have notions like disinterestedness, treating the work on its own terms, certain forms of interpretation being appropriate and other forms being inappropriate, i.e. those that don't focus on distinctive features of the object. So we have these kinds of norms. And one set, as I say, is engagement norms. We also have communicative norms. So we think that our appreciative practices push us to specify what's of particular aesthetic value in artworks. We have a restriction on using cliches in certain ways. We have a restriction on purely specifying the value of one artwork in terms of the value of another. We also have norms of assertion. So something like a norm that we shouldn't make aesthetic assertions unless we're acquainted with the object we're making the assertion about. So as I say, I'm going to focus on the engagement norms now, but just one thing to note. So when I talk about the normative structure of appreciation, this involves restrictions. So something like requirements, like don't completely defer to testimony, might seem to be a requirement. So if we do that, we might be criticizable for doing that. And the same with the no assertion without acquaintance. We might be criticizable if we assert something when we're not acquainted with a work. So there are specific normative restrictions, but there also is this more general sense in which there's a normative structure of our practices which seems to be designed to promote a particular good. So the communicative norms, the object focus, these seem to be pushing us towards doing a certain kind of thing and getting a certain kind of good out of the practice. So theories of the normative structure of appreciation are going to identify a candidate for what that good is. So what does the normative structure of appreciation kind of nudge us towards promoting? So the two things I'm going to discuss is a kind of view about correct judgment being the thing that our appreciative practices push us towards, and another view where it's aesthetic pleasure that our appreciative practices are structured to promote. But before we do that, it's good to identify these two separate questions. So when we have these theories of the normative structure of appreciation, they can be assessed relative to these two different questions. So the first question is the question of normative structure. And there how we can assess the account is by how well its identification of a particular good explains the structure, the normative structure of appreciation. So the task of accounts is to identify a good, so like correct judgment or aesthetic pleasure, and then explain how the normative structure of appreciation is well suited to promote this good. So I'm going to come on to talk about that a bit more. So hopefully it'll become a little bit clearer then. So the second question is the question of normative authority. So this is what makes the normative structure of appreciation authoritative, or in kind of more layman's terms, why ought I as an individual or we as a community adhere to the norms of appreciation? So those are two questions that we're going to come on to discuss. So I'm going to make an assumption that our aesthetic appreciative practices are genuinely or robustly normative. That is, that we really do have some kind of reason to act in accordance with the norms of appreciation. And I'm going to take it as my task to defend a cognitivist view. And by that, I mean a view that the good promoted by the normative structure of appreciation is an epistemic good. And surprise, surprise, that epistemic good is going to be aesthetic understanding. But that's going to come a little bit later after we've discussed these two views, these two theories of the normative structure of appreciation. So very simply, the correct cognitivism view says the following, that the normative structure of our appreciative practices has as its purpose the promotion of a correct judgment, where this judgment is understood as relevantly similar to a belief and to normal belief forming processes. So I'm taking this view out of T. Nguyen's paper. So this is the view he kind of argues against, and it's probably worth noting for all cognitivists out there, I'm aware that this is a straw man view, that no one holds this view, and that it's kind of not a very interesting view at all. But it's important to note that this straw man version of cognitivism allows one to isolate the epistemic good that appreciation promotes from the kind of the manifestation of aesthetic value in an agent's engagement with a work of art. So because he has this very thin understanding of what the cognitivist's view is, that it's just promoting correct judgments, he's able to separate what's actually a value in aesthetic engagement from the epistemic goal. And on the back of this, he puts forward a view called, T. Nguyen puts forward a view called engagement, that I call engagement hedonism. So it's ambiguous in one of his papers whether it's a form of hedonism, but he's subsequently clarified that it is a form of hedonism. So this second view, engagement hedonism, is the thought that though correctness is a nominal aim of appreciation, the purpose of appreciation is to promote a pleasurable form of autonomous engagement with artwork. So here's what he says: in aesthetic appreciation, we aim at correctness, but correctness is not the purpose. It is only the right goal to adopt in order to become engaged in a desirable, that is pleasurable, form of activity. So Nguyen thinks that striving to form correct judgments pushes us to engage autonomously versus, for example, deferring to testimony with artworks, and this striving is hedonically valuable. So we can kind of set up on the question of normative structure, we can see how these two theories would explain the nature of our norms of engagement. So correctness cognitivism identifies the promoted good as correct judgment. How does it respond to the deference restriction? Well, it's not clear how it can respond, because it would be a much more reliable process, a reliable way to promote correct judgments, I think, if we just deferred all the time to experts. So it seems like, at least with this kind of straw man version of cognitivism, the correctness cognitivism gets off to a bad start. It can't really explain why we have this restriction on deference if what we're aiming at is correct judgments. And similarly with autonomous engagement. So non-autonomous engagement, like again, deferring to critics or experts, would be a more efficient route to correct judgment than working it out oneself and taking the time that takes. So on object focus, it fares a little bit better. So it encourages nuanced attention to the object and cognitive sensitivity to its particular aesthetic character and value. And this focus on the object promotes correct and particularized judgments. So compare that with engagement hedonism. So what's promoted? What's the good primarily promoted by our practices? Well, it's this pleasurable autonomous engagement in striving to form correct judgments. So what explains the deference restriction? Well, if we deferred, then we wouldn't engage in this valuable form of activity. So kind of we can explain why there's a restriction on deference. And again, why does our practices push us to engage autonomously? Well, because it's precisely in the autonomy that that we have this pleasurable form of engagement. Why the object focus? Well, the answer to this one is kind of less straightforward, but again, focus on object encourages pleasurable striving engagement, as attention to nuance is conducive to richly pleasurable autonomous engagement. So as opposed to some idiosyncratic kind of subjective way of relating to artworks. So one interesting thing, so now moving on, that's the question of normative structure. So we found out correctness cognitivism can't really explain very well why our appreciative practices have the normative structure they do. But also on the question of normative authority, T also thinks he has a kind of good view against cognitivism. So he says, correct judgments, and I think this is probably right, if you conceive of aesthetic judgment as he does, correct judgments are of little or no fundamental value. So gesturing to the pursuit of correct judgment could not by itself explain the normative authority of our appreciative norms, right? If we had a choice between engaging in the pleasurable thing that T focuses on, or just having judgments that are true, then it would seem like we had more reason to engage in the valuable form of striving activity. So instead, T on the engagement hedonism account explains the normative structure of our appreciative practices derivatively and in a non-epistemic terms. The source of aesthetic normativity is the final value of the pleasurable striving activity, which is characteristic of aesthetic engagement. Okay, so I just want to kind of note one thing about the question of normative authority and the nature of T's account as a derivative account. So recall the norm for object focus. So T says the best explanation is that we value the specific form of activity involved in pursuing correct aesthetic judgments, i.e. we value the pleasurable nature of this activity. So his thesis is that norms relating to object focus when appreciating, for example, Guernica, are ultimately explained because they promote a pleasurable form of engagement. So it's a derivative account and it focuses solely on one good of the aesthetic, which is pleasure. So the question we can ask at this stage is, why focus only on that good? Why focus on that, solely that normative source? So why not focus on the cognitive value of Guernica, or the moral value, or its value in expressing emotion, etc., etc. So focusing on those values and sourcing the normative authority of appreciation in those goods would seem to give us a more robust normative source and a better way to explain why we really should follow the norms of our practice. So we can contrast then T's view, which is derivative, so it identifies a value other than the aesthetic in which to ground the norms of appreciation, and T's view, which is restrictive, so it's a restrictive form of derivativism. It identifies only one of the goods of aesthetic as the normative source. And we can say, why not just be pluralist derivativists, i.e. ground the normativity of our appreciative practices in a plurality of goods that those practices promote. So as I said before, Guernica's cognitive value, its moral value, all the other values that it has. So if we want to go down this route, we're going to have a problem though. And the problem is going to be how a pluralist account can give a principled answer to the question of normative structure. So how could our appreciative practices have developed to have a stable normative structure if this structure serves to promote a wide array of different goods? Well, the answer, and I am getting towards the end now, the answer is that the normative structure is unified. It does have one goal. It's structured so as to promote aesthetic understanding. And why is it structured to promote that? Well, it's because it's in aesthetic understanding that we elicit the various goods of the aesthetic. So when we're working to understand Guernica, it's precisely in working to understand the work that we're able to elicit its cognitive value. That is, that we're able to occupy the perspective that it offers and explore the cognitive value that it has, as well as the aesthetic value and whatever else we want. So that's this is only kind of a shape of a view at the moment, but this is this kind of shape of the view that I want to put up. So the normative structure is explained because it promotes aesthetic understanding, and aesthetic understanding is the route to the goods of the aesthetic. So it doesn't matter if you think emotional communion is the important thing, or aesthetic value, cognitive value, moral value. The route to all of these values, to getting at what's distinctively valuable about the artwork we're engaging with, is going to be through aesthetic understanding, not through pleasure, not through perception understood on secondary quality model, not through anything else. It's going to be through something like aesthetic understanding. So on the question of normative authority, it's not the case that the normative authority is sourced in correctness or in the correctness of any judgment or any response. Rather, the normative authority derives from the plurality of goods that aesthetic understanding enables access to. And at that point, I will stop because I think I've already gone 1 minute over. Thank you, Teresa, for being charitable there.